The October Big Day takes place this year on October the 14th, and the Casual Birder podcast will again be entering a team. I hope you will join us. You don't have to be an expert birder, just be able to identify the birds in your local area. It's really exciting discovering what birds you're all finding, and it would be wonderful to have you as part of our virtual team, wherever you are in the world. As part of the event, we will also be raising funds for BirdLife International. If you're able to support our fundraiser by making a donation or by sharing the link with others, that would be awesome. You can find the link for that in the episode notes. Welcome to the Casual Birder podcast. I'm Suzy Buttress. As a casual birder, I take pleasure in watching the wild birds around me, wherever I am. In my show, I share the joy of birding. I tell you about the birds I've seen, speak with experts and enthusiasts, go on bird outings, and I share stories from birders around the world. Last episode, birder and photographer Chiara Talia told how a walk in the park and a chance encounter with a European robin led to a passion for bird photography and a pathway to healing at a time when she was struggling with her mental health. Do take a listen. Back in July, I attended the Global Birdfair in Rutland. This year was particularly exciting because the organisers, working with Swarovski Optic, provided an outdoor stage for a selection of nature podcasts to record episodes with their special guests in front of a live audience. I was a little greedy and interviewed a whole host of fabulous people over that weekend, and I'll be sharing those episodes with you over the next few months. For this first episode of the series, I'm delighted to share my conversation with two inspiring women who hold leadership positions in the world of conservation. Beccy Speight, Chief Executive of the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and Patricia Zurita, who until very recently was the CEO of BirdLife International and is now Chief Strategy Officer for Conservation International. So, Beccy and Patricia, thank you so much for joining me on the Casual Birder podcast. I feel quite in awe speaking to both of you because I've been a member of the RSPB since I was so high.
Thank you.
And Patricia, we've been getting involved as a Casual Birder podcast team for the Global Big Day and the Global Bird Weekends, and we've been raising money for BirdLife International.
Thank you.
You've both had different paths to where you've got to today. So could you tell me about your organisation, how you've got to where you've got to, and most importantly, have there been any great bird observations or experiences you've had on the way there?
So first of all, Suzy, thank you so much for having me here. BirdLife is, for those of you who don't know, it's an amazing family of 120 organizations in 117 countries. So we really believe in the role of working together and empowering and enabling local organizations because they are the true stewards of conservation in the future. So I got to this through a very funny path. I started studying architecture and I got really bored. And a friend of mine said, why don't you go and take this seminar on birds of the Andes? I'm from Ecuador. And while I was in college, I had to take all of these different credits from all the different schools. So I did this amazing seminar in the cloud forest in northwestern Quito, where I am from. And I saw the cock of the rock leg in display at 4 a.m. in the middle of the cloud forest. And at that time, that forest wasn't threatened by the road construction that was taking to the coast. So I found a way of really clicking with something that I really cared about, and then suddenly ended up studying environmental sciences and then environmental economics. And I work with local communities, empowering them to really find the economic benefit of working for and with nature in Conservation International many years ago. And then I moved into BirdLife, and I've been with BirdLife 8.5 years. I'm actually left BirdLife 14 days ago. and I'm moving back to the United States, back to Conservation International. But, to me, birds are the extraordinary and absolutely ultra plus ambassador of nature. They are the pinnacle that show us what's happening with the rest of the planet. And while I'm moving to CI again, I will continue to champion birds and bird conservation because I truly believe it helps nature.
And Becky, what was your path to getting to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because the RSPB was one of the original founders of BirdLife, which showed great vision, I think, about what was going to be needed, around the world to make conservation possible. We're obviously a UK-based organisation, so we have about 220 reserves across the UK, about 160,000 hectares of land that we either own or we manage. And we have 1.2 million members, for which I feel enormously grateful, who are just amazing, and thank you so much for being a member. I always say we do 5 things. So we work on places, so we work to make really, really good habitats for wildlife. We work on species, so that's about keeping our most common species still abundant and common, and we're really losing that abundance at the moment, so that's really important. But also stopping species from going extinct, some of our rarest species. We also work on policy, so making sure that we've got the big frameworks we need to make nature recovery possible, and that's kind of UK governments, but also globally as well. And then we also work on science, so we have a big team of scientists who provide a lot of the evidence for our conservation approaches, and we work with people to really engage people with nature. And we would say that our work kind of sits at that kind of nexus of climate and nature. That's where our work sits. And I couldn't agree more with Patricia that birds are a fantastic lens through which you can look at all of that. And it's really important times for our work, I think, at the moment. And I came to it through an even more eclectic path than Patricia, in that I was a management consultant just prior to 2000, so I was really on the dark side. And I loved the buzz of that, but at the end of the day, I wanted to do something that I felt was more meaningful for what I really cared about, which was the fate of the natural world and the fate of our heritage as well. And so after that, I moved into the National Trust. Then I was CEO of the Woodland Trust for 5 years, and now at RSPB. So I don't know quite what that eclectic path has given me, but I suppose it's given me that broader view. And my big birding, well, there are 2 that I'd like to talk about. One was, long before I worked for the RSPB, I remember I live in Nottingham, and so from the cloud forests to a car park in Nottingham, I was in a supermarket car park in Nottingham, and there were 2 guys with a scope, and I thought, what are they doing? And then, of course, I realised they were looking at waxwings, and waxwings had arrived in this supermarket car park, and they were allowing everybody to kind of use their scope and look at them, and they were RSPB volunteers, and I thought, that's pretty cool, that this organisation has got people in a car park in Nottingham, looking at these exotic birds. And then the other experience I had was I went to Mull, and I saw the reintroduced, white-tailed eagle in flight, and just that was so exciting. I mean, it's such a huge bird, and so dramatic. And to think, and I'd also been to the Tomb of the Eagles in Orkney, where that's a really ancient place where they found lots and lots of eagle remains. And to think that this bird had kind of disappeared and gone extinct because of kind of things like persecution, but then come back, was really exciting. I mean, that is absolutely nature recovery in action. And so those were both really inspirational things for me along the way.
To hear you both talk about working with the communities where these birds are suffering troubles, how do you engage those communities? Because here we've got an audience that love birds, but in the general public, everyone's engaged on their own path, and especially with organisations, with commerce. How do you get people to realise that their actions have an impact on the environment, and then get them to work with you to conserve these species without coming in a very domineering way to say you should be doing this? Yeah. So how do you engage people?
So let me start from more the international side, and then you can talk more about the UK. First of all, I think we may not realize it, but I think people realize birds a lot more than we think they do. Partly because they're everywhere. And, my panda friends may forgive me here, but, you wake up in the morning and you open the drapes or you come outside and the first thing that you see is a bird. It's not a panda. So you actually engage with nature, and through the COVID pandemic, we saw this. People actually realizing that birds were out there. They were hearing them more. At local level, indigenous communities and local communities, in most of the cases that I have found, they are incredibly proud of having these species. Egyptians back in the days of the pharaohs, they were using the vultures as a veneration, as a god, because they had the vision of seeing wide and really large, right? In my country, in Ecuador, the condor, the Andean condor, is the emblem of the country. In the United States, the bald eagle is the bird of the country. So I think there's a lot more of a cultural connection with birds than almost anything else, and partly because they're everywhere, because they're visible, they're beautiful. So I think it's more about triggering that and kind of scratching a little bit the dust of the pride that people actually feel about their birds, and just using them to reconnect us to nature. I think it's a lot easier than we think it is, and I think it's more about us recognizing how they see these amazing birds and help them, enact all of this conservation action rather than coming and telling them, you have to do this. It's just more about, you have seen these birds and they have been part of your life all this time. They're declining. We need to work on this together. And they immediately get it and start working with you. So I think it's a lot easier with birds than any other type of species, actually.
Becky, how would you see that for the UK?
So I think, a bit like Patricia said, the COVID pandemic actually made quite a difference in the UK, I think, because we were confined to our immediate kind of patches, in terms of being able to go for our daily exercise. And I really noticed people noticing nature much more in their localities and, really being quite interested in it. I remember going for a walk in my local park in Nottingham and seeing a whole group of people stopped because they'd heard a woodpecker drumming. And I'd never seen that happen in the park before. It was always just about kicking footballs around and walking your dog. So that was really interesting. And I think some of that has lasted on, people being suddenly aware that they were surrounded by this amazing kind of stuff. And I think I always say, when you look through your window, a bit like Patricia was saying, you're seeing something that's very ordinary in that you're seeing maybe a blackbird or a sparrow or whatever, but it's also something that's really other, and the more you kind of start to find out about that, the more exciting it gets. So I think often it's just about making that little flip for people and flicking that switch. But I also think what's been interesting this year for us is that we co-produced Wild Isles, the TV series, with WWF. And that has been amazing. So I think 10 million people watched that series, and I have people coming up to me all the time and saying how amazed they were by the wildlife that is here in the UK, birds and other wildlife, and how they now feel about that, and wanting to kind of hang on to it and realising that it's fragile, that they need to do something if they want their kids to be able to kind of experience that. So I think that kind of, what I would call kind of big engagement pieces are really, really important. And the reason it's so important is not just because, you might love wildlife and not want it to disappear, but because those ecosystems underpin everybody's lives. And I do think people are starting to wake up to that as well, that we've got to worry about the climate, but we've also got to worry about nature. And even if you aren't in the least bit interested in birds, you need those healthy natural ecosystems because they underpin all of our lives. And I think people are starting to realise that. But it's all about kind of, I think, starting from where people are at. You can't kind of impose a wonderful kind of, picture of things and expect people to get it. You have to start from where they're at, whether that's birds in their own garden or their local park, or whether it's thinking about kind of, if you're in business, it's thinking about those risks because of disappearing ecosystems around you. So, start from where people are at.
Absolutely. Now, I mentioned earlier about, how inspirational it is to see women in senior positions in conservation. What kind of insight could you give us about the challenges you might have faced coming through in, let's be honest, it has been a fairly male-dominated area. Have you faced challenges, or has it been a complete breeze?
It's been challenging. I've always and I will always feel incredibly honored to be the first woman of a developing country leading an international conservation organization, and it was really hard to get there, right? I mean, in a male-dominated until recently environment, you are not always taken seriously, and and I was coming from the south, so it was even worse. But I would say what you need, and my advice to my girls, I have 12-year-old twin girls, is, find what you love to do, and if it is conservation, just keep at it. There's a huge group of women right now that are supporting each other and really building up the spaces. And I think what we have done is break that glass ceiling and make sure that people realize that we can lead well, and that we can transform these organizations to make them more effective, more caring, more reaching out to everybody. So I think it's changing. It's great to see so many women leading conservation organizations now. And, we have the responsibility to keep opening that path for other women. And I'll keep doing that.
Of course you will. We're going to miss you. So definitely you have encounters along the way that are sort of funny as much as anything, I have to say. I was just at a reception the other night, and somebody immediately came up to me and found out that I worked for the RSPB, didn't ask what I did for the RSPB, and immediately started berating me about something, and then finally said, "And what do you do for the RSPB?" And I said, "Well, I'm the chief executive." And he kind of reeled back, in kind of horror. And I think it's just about expectations, isn't it? So there's still kind of some expectations that, the chief exec is probably going to be a man, and I think that still exists to a certain extent in some generations today. Although I think it's changing fast. I think it's really changing fast, which is great.
In the age of influencers, I think it's really helpful for us to see women, people from communities that haven't been as well supported in the past. I think, it's really useful for us to normalise the fact that actually anyone can get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is that the scale of challenges we have in the natural world now, and its kind of restoration recovery, are huge. That absolutely requires collaboration. And I think there hasn't, in the past, been enough collaboration in the sector and, from the sector with business and government and so on. And I think, this is a sweeping generalisation, I'll probably get shot down in flames for it, but I do think because of the social environment in which girls grow up often, they are good at communication, they tend to be good at collaboration and working with other people and achieving things through that. So I think it's about kind of capabilities and the time, and those two come together, I think, in women leaders at the moment. It might not always be like this, but right now I think it's absolutely the right kind of skills to be bringing to the challenges we've got facing us.
Yeah, and I think not gatekeeping, absolutely working together, because we're all in it together. Do you have programmes for women coming through, or for communities that just haven't been represented before?
Yes, so BirdLife has an amazing capacity development program that reaches out not only to the partnership, the 120 organizations, but beyond to the communities that are working with them. And it's about building up their expertise as leaders, but also as managers and as project leads, and ensuring that they have the ability to really connect with each other. And we just launched a fellowship program to build up the leadership skills of the key people, the champions and the shining stars in the partnership that will be taking the lead of the partnership in the next 20 years, maybe less, 10, 15. And really building up their skills into what Beccy was saying, communications, presentation, being able to, speak in public and, talk to leaders, to governments, to donors, to the corporate sector. And the most important thing for me, whether it is men or women, is actually enabling and from the onset, building up that cohesion of them working together. Because as Beccy said, one of the things about women leadership is that we are less elbowy than men by nature, and I think we are able to reach out. But the more that we can actually get these groups of mixed gender and mixed and complete diverse groups working and learning together, the more that we build up that cohort of collaboration from the onset. And as you said, we are on this together. This task is way bigger than just one single organization. So unless we actually make it happen together, we're not going to win. So I think people and the conservation community is starting to realize that. And I think building up those leaders with that mindset from the beginning is incredibly important.
Thank you. I've just been told that we've only got a few more minutes. So what I would really like to know is, for each of you, if you had a day birding, fantasy day, anywhere in the world, seeing any birds, where would you be?
I would love to go and see the new hummingbird species in the southern cordillera in Ecuador. So there's a new species of hummingbird was described about maybe 3 years ago, and it's a very small population. We think that there are only about 250 perhaps. So I do want to go and see that one, but it's in a very secluded place, hard to get, but hopefully one day.
I hope so.
I've just come back from Shetland, so I'm lucky, aren't I? I get to go to amazing places with my job, and the thing that really struck me about Shetland was the kind of completeness of the soundscape of birds that you get in places on Shetland. And I was lucky enough to go over to Musa, which is one of the islands, and you hear storm petrels who are nesting in the walls and in the broch itself, and then you've got this background of lots and lots of drumming snipe, and just to hear those two sounds together was brilliant. So I would go back there like a shot and just kind of lie on my back in the grass and just listen to that amazing soundscape.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me on the Casual Birder podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
My thanks to Beccy and Patricia for taking the time to speak with me, to Oscar Henderson for handling the production of the show at Global Birdfair, and to Charlie Bingham for her work in scheduling the guests for interview. If you'd like to find out more about the RSPB and BirdLife International, links to both are in the episode notes. A couple of weekends ago, I finally managed to get outside at sunset to try and find a nightjar. Nightjars are nocturnal birds which are found on heaths and moorlands. We're very lucky to have nightjars nesting at a local reserve, Hazley Heath. As the sun sets and the sky darkens, you may hear them start to call. They look a little like kestrels or cuckoos in their body shape, a little chunky with swept back wings. During the daytime, when roosting, they're very difficult to see. Their plumage acts as great camouflage against the trees they rest on. Several times this summer, when I knew we were due a calm, clear evening, I made plans with John to go and find them. However, I'm terrible for getting settled in the evenings, and what sounds like a fab idea earlier in the day loses all appeal as nighttime approaches. With August fast disappearing, along with the chance of finding one at all this year, they migrate to Africa for the winter, I decided to make the effort to go. John plays five-a-side football on Friday evenings, so I went with him and I did some birding while he played, and I practised recording with my new vlogging kit. We then intended to go to Hazley Heath afterwards. Luckily, the sunset was about 2 hours earlier at around 8:30 p.m. than it had been when I tried to go earlier in the summer, so that certainly helped with my plans. While I was recording my bird outing, I got talking to David, who was riding his recumbent tricycle along the pathway. We talked about the birds I'd found, and he asked about my blogging kit. David also mentioned that having had a stroke a few years ago, the tricycle was a great way for him to enjoy the outdoors. He also mentioned that he was working on a project to create virtual pilgrimages by cycling the number of miles the pilgrimage would take. It was really interesting speaking with him, a benefit of talking to people while out birding. After John had finished playing football, we headed over to Hazley Heath to look for the nightjar. This is the piece that I recorded while there. We've come out to Hazley Heath in the hopes of hearing and seeing nightjar. It's probably the last chance I'll get this year. They may already have left, but we'll go and find out. There's an oak tree that we have definitely seen nightjars in before, and there's an area where we know that they nest. Now, they'll probably have finished nesting for the year, but we can but hope. So I'll hopefully be sharing some sounds of nightjars. We're here at the place we call Nightjar Point, which is where we found nightjar before, and we're just going to sit here and have some snacks, wait for the sun to set a bit further, and listen out for the sound of nightjars. Yes, success. We were sitting on the bench in the area where we've seen nightjars before, and one started chirring in the tree right above us. We were able to see it fly out several times. It flew out and round and came back and then chirred a bit longer. It could be that it's the last one here before migrating, but thankfully I've seen and heard a nightjar in 2023. Wonderful. Last weekend I went to a new-to-me RSPB site, Winterbourne Downs. It's only around half an hour away, and I found out through the wonderful women of the Hampshire Ornithological Society's Lady Birders group that Stone-Curlews had been breeding there. I've only ever seen Stone-Curlews once before, when on vacation on the Spanish island of Menorca in 2015. From the villa where we were staying, we had heard some really eerie calls around sunset and could not work out what kind of bird made them. Luckily, with lots of scanning around over a few days, I finally pinpointed the birds and identified them as Stone-Curlew. I could see they had long legs for the size of bird, and they appeared to have large eyes. I even managed to get a grainy photograph of them. Here's a recording of the calls that I made as they flew over one evening. Stone-Curlews are rare summer visitors to the UK. They're from a family of birds known as thick-knees and are related to waders. They're quite large, about crow-sized, and have big eyes, which helps as they hunt for their food at night. I had no idea that I might ever see Stone-Curlews in England, and certainly not relatively close to home in Wiltshire. It was a hot and windy day when we headed out to Winterbourne Downs. We got there later than we'd intended, and I was worried that earlier in the day we might have had a better chance of seeing any activity. But while we were getting our kit from the car, we heard the calls of several Stone-Curlew, and I was hopeful of actually seeing them. Because they're so rare in the UK, they're a protected species, and we could only view them from screening that had been set up on the reserve. They're very susceptible to disturbance. Given the heat of the day and the strong wind, we could only view the birds through a heat haze, and with our scope and tripod being buffeted by the wind. But they were exactly the birds we'd seen on Menorca, and a new bird for my UK list. It's not all rosy on my bird list, however. We thought we'd seen a sandwich tern on a recent visit to Titchfield Haven. It had a white forehead, and I thought I could see a yellow tip to the bill. I posted a picture of it on my Top 5 Birds post that I share each Sunday on social media. Ollie, a friend of past guest Mel Shepherd-Wells, kindly corrected my posting on Instagram, pointing out that the red legs, small bill and black on the wings pointed to a young common tern instead. Checking in Colin's bird guide, I could see why my inexperience had led to the wrong identification. I'm very grateful to Ollie for reaching out and adding to my birding knowledge. If you'd like to support the show's production, you can add to the show's tip jar by buying me a virtual coffee at ko-fi.com. Thanks so much to the following people who have contributed to the show's tip jar since the last episode: Merilee, Annika, Rona, and an anonymous supporter. If you're also able to contribute, you'll find the link in the episode notes. But all of your support, financial or otherwise, is very much appreciated. I love hearing about your sightings. Tell me about them by leaving me a message or voicemail using the contact form on my website, casualbirder.com. And maybe consider signing up for the Casual Birder Bird Club. We meet virtually once a month to share our birding stories or to watch presentations from special guests. Take a look at the episode notes for the links to these. My thanks to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by The Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. Check out their website at dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast.